It's a burning, fighting sports extravaganza on a weirdly violent episode of NES Works. For sports-loving former NES owners of a certain age, one sports game stands head and shoulders above the rest. Jaleco's Bases Loaded. Now, this wasn't the best baseball sim for NES, and it ultimately wasn't the best looking. But timing, as they say, is everything. Bases Loaded arrived in the summer of 1988, once the NES had really hit the mass market threshold, but a year ahead of any actual console competition. Next-generation platforms Sega Genesis and NEC TurboGrafx 16 would arrive the following summer and change the equation, but for the time being, Nintendo more or less owned the American console market. By this point, it seemed like every other household in the country had an NES hooked up to the family TV. And with that critical mass, both Nintendo and third-party licensees alike had a massive audience, eager for fresh, exciting new games. I mention this context because it's important to understanding why Bases Loaded made such a huge impression. Tens of millions of kids had access to the NES, and the country's collective love for baseball was at a sort of peak. According to the site Sports Prospectus, baseball was nearing its all-time record for attendance in 1988. Meanwhile, Fangraphs Baseball claims the mid-80s saw the sport's highest ever television ratings, especially for the World Series. Looking at the NES library to date, though, you'd hardly have known it. Prior to summer of 1988, the console had only one baseball title out of a library of more than 100 games. Nintendo's own baseball, whose code was nearing the 5-year-old mark, practically a retro game by 80s standards, and whose presence at retail had largely evaporated as Nintendo phased out the black box line. Suddenly, a deluge of baseball titles appeared. LJN shipped Major League Baseball in April, followed soon after by the July releases of RBI Baseball and Bases Loaded. While more advanced than Nintendo's game in most respects, MLB and RBI hewed closely to the look and format Nintendo had laid down back on Famicom in 1983. And that was fine, but they didn't quite fit this market. The big-headed, round-bodied player sprites were far better suited to Japanese audiences, who gravitated toward friendly and approachable visuals, whereas American gamers favored a little more realism. Bases Loaded, by contrast to those other games, enthusiastically ditched the Nintendo look in favor of a style more in line with US-developed baseball sims. With its realistically proportioned players and more dynamic pitching viewpoint, Bases Loaded looked and played more in line with the better flavor of Atari 2600 and Intellivision games. Well, more to the point, it looked and played a lot like Accolade's Hardball, a Commodore 64 baseball sim by Bob Whitehead that had shipped around the same time as the NES's test launch and made every console baseball title to date, including Nintendo's, look downright archaic. There doesn't seem to be much room to argue that Jaleco didn't work from Hardball as their template for this game. Bases Loaded duplicates Hardball's trademark behind the pitcher perspective directly, begins by allowing players to customize their team lineups, and shifts over to an aerial view that depicts most, but not all, of the field once the ball is hit. This is a pretty direct lift, and that's perfectly fine. Nothing else on consoles at the time looked like this. As a computer publisher, Accolade wouldn't deign to enter the console space until 1990, and even then they skipped the 8-bit market altogether and jumped immediately to TurboGrafx 16 and Genesis. Jaleco, like nature, abhors a vacuum, so they filled it. Bases Loaded lacked the depth and visual richness of its apparent inspiration, but it did a pretty good job of recreating baseball in a format that spoke to American kids a lot more than the NES's other ball games did, even if it lacked MLB's licensed grasp at authenticity. Bases Loaded has its downsides. The pitching viewpoint, in which players see the batter's box from the pitcher's perspective in a skewed angle reminiscent of televised games, definitely works to the pitcher's advantage. Connecting with the ball as a batter can be irritatingly tricky. The angle and small scale at which you see the strike zone turns the act of batting into something of an exercise in guesswork, which I does suppose at least have the benefit of keeping scores low and turning a two-player game into something of a pitcher's duel rather than a chase to max out the scoreboard. Would you be surprised to learn that this difficulty does not extend to the CPU, who can casually swat the ball into the stratosphere? No, you would not. This is, after all, an 8-bit baseball game. But back in 1988, NES kids were more than happy to suffer through some slightly kludgy interface quirks in order to enjoy such an unabashedly cool take on their favorite sport. RBI Baseball may have been a better, deeper take on the game, but Bases Loaded's television-style perspective, expressive player sprites, and brisk pacing made for a more exciting cartridge. The kind of game you could show, say, a console-hesitant parent to allay their skepticism about this whole Nintendo thing. Thanks to its craftily borrowed style and ideal timing, Bases Loaded became the hot sports game for 1988, and it certainly did more to entrench Jaleco in the annals of NES history than City Connection had. Jaleco quickly doubled down on NES sports releases, following up not only with Bases Loaded sequels, but also venturing into other pastimes like tennis with October 1988's Racket Attack, street basketball with June 1989's Hoops, and soccer with October 1989's Goal. Most of these games would make their way to Game Boy, too. Of course, Jaleco would continue to publish non-sports titles as well, including weirdo action games like Totally Rad and Astyanax, and the deeply questionable Wampum. But outside of their great adaptation of Lucasfilm Games' Maniac Mansion, none of these titles found anywhere near the traction of Bases Loaded among American audiences. And over on the Japan side, well, here we find quite a US-Japan cultural divide emerging. As much as American NES fans tend to venerate Bases Loaded, the game's Famicom equivalent, Moero Pro Yakyuu, has become enshrined as an absolute laughingstock. Thankfully, Something Awful Forums poster Random Stranger recently posted about the tarnished legacy of Bases Loaded in its home territory. According to them, Moero Pro Yakyuu sold extraordinarily well at launch, hitting something like 1.3 million sales in its first week on the market. It sold so well, in fact, that Jaleco gutted cartridge shells from another release in order to be able to ship enough copies to meet demand. Namco's Family Stadium, better known here as RBI Baseball, had been one of the console's best-selling titles, so retailer and fan expectations ran high for the system's next landmark take on the sport. Jaleco had proven almost as durable, if not quite as skilled, as Namco, so their next Famicom release was bound to be pretty solid, right? Well, no, not quite. Although Moero Pro Yakyuu and Bases Loaded contain fundamentally the same content, Bases Loaded benefited from several rounds of revisions that the initial Japanese release did not. It's impossible to know what precisely happened with the first revision of the game, but it shipped in a state that could only be called unfortunate. Developer Tosei, Jaleco's go-to for Famicom development, created a baseball game that looked the part, but its code was riddled with enough bugs to make every playthrough a bit of a gamble. Would you be able to finish the game without falling prey to some unfortunate glitch? According to Random Stranger, these glitches included any pitch after a player hits a foul ball counts as a strike, no matter how far outside the strike zone it hits. The AI can become stuck in an infinite loop of switching designated hitters in and out. One player on each team can bunt the ball out of the park. Stats were incredibly unbalanced, with pitchers being abnormally weak and batters being abnormally strong. In short, a mess of a game. Jaleco pushed out a revised ROM as quickly as they could, but this predates the age of downloadable patches by several decades. The 1.1 revision arrived far too late for the 1.3 million Famicom owners who saw the enticing graphics and read the glowing advance reviews and bought a comically broken baseball game. This perfect storm resulted in the Japanese market being flooded with more than 1 million cartridges that had almost zero value for anyone but full-set collectors. Moero Pro Yakyuu quickly succumbed to a well-deserved reputation as kusoge, becoming perhaps the most unwanted Famicom cart in terms of actual desirability versus availability. The game's reputation improved very slightly in the earliest days of the internet, as it became a meme among Japanese Famicom enthusiasts, a game so worthless yet so pervasive that it took on new value as a joke. Bloggers purchased carts by the hundred in order to build objects out of them, or to photograph themselves in comical situations, such as bathing in Moero Pro Yakyuu carts. Of course, American kids in 1988 were aware of exactly none of this. Bases Loaded arrived in time to become one of the hot games of holiday 1988, and a quick survey of old newspaper articles reveals it was one of that year's most commonly cited titles, mentioned in stories about how the NES itself was the single hottest toy for that Christmas season. All of this despite its sticker shock. I mentioned the fact that Double Dragon raised the bar for new NES release pricing, but a mere month later, Bases Loaded nudged that bar a little higher. according to a 1988 column by Detroit Free Press columnist Stephen Advocat, Jaleco priced its game $10 higher than any other card for the system due to its record-setting 2.5 megabit cartridge. It sounds to me a bit like someone swallowed a marketing spiel, hook, line, and sinker. But the NES version definitely did ship on a larger ROM than the Japanese game. Among other things, the increased data capacity allowed Jaleco to incorporate some beefy voice samples into the US cartridge.
Strike.
Although contemporary sales flyers don't quite bear out that claim of a $10 gap, Bases Loaded does consistently appear in the archives as the most expensive NES game of that year, commanding prices anywhere from $38 to $50. It cost even more than white-hot releases like Super Mario Bros. 2 and Zelda 2. Considering that the NES had launched just 3 years earlier, with games priced between $20 and $25, that's quite a prodigious inflation rate in a very short period of time. Only the hefty premium attached to Sega's Phantasy Star prevented Bases Loaded from being the single most expensive console game of its era. The NES library would only become pricier, eventually topping out with carts like Dragon Warrior 4 that topped the $60 mark. The console's decade-long evolution by way of advanced mapper chips and larger storage capacity came at a literal price. But hey, so what if Bases Loaded cost a lot? Look at those graphics.
Strike.
Also of note, for July 1988, Tengen not only launched RBI Baseball this month, but also Gauntlet. Although I covered those games back in NES Works in 1987, researchers such as Kevin Bunch of Atari Archives have definitively pinned down July 1988 as Tengen's actual entree into the US market. Since then, most online sources have updated and corrected their Tengen title dates to 1988, reflecting the actual release dates as opposed to the erroneous 1987 dates that were so common online before. I'm pleased that my now incorrect chronology, drawn from so many of these resources, could stand as the bellwether for getting the actual facts out there. Anyway, skipping ahead briefly to September 1988, we have a game that was much less hated among Famicom enthusiasts and less expensive for NES owners. The platform's second entry into the golf genre, Lee Trevino's Fighting Golf. Fighting Golf shares a lot in common with Nintendo's Black Box Golf, but it features nicer graphics and additional features, as you'd expect from a game that was developed 4.5 years more recently. As will be the case with almost every video golf game we'll see until Golden Tee and its trackball comes along, Fighting Golf uses more or less the same rule set as Nintendo's game. Sorry, Champion Golf, no one loves you. Gameplay consists of advancing hole by hole through a golf course, attempting to earn the lowest score possible by sinking the ball in as few swings and putts as you can. The game gives you a windowed view with simplified menus that allows you to select your club, take aim into the distance, and determine the power of your stroke by timing your button press along a power meter. Naturally, you need to worry about such factors as the distance to the green, the direction and velocity of the wind, and the placement of hazards around the course. No one wants to end up in a bunker or water hazard, obviously. Were that the full extent of Fighting Golf, it would be a fine update to the genre, but maybe not quite enough to warrant a purchase unless you just really love video golf and were craving a fresh 18 holes to play on NES. It's a more detailed, more visually impressive iteration on a game format last seen at the system's launch. And as with Black Box Baseball, Nintendo's golf had grown increasingly scarce at retail by late 1988 as Nintendo phased out its launch lineup. However, Fighting Golf does have more to offer than Nintendo Golf. For starters, you begin the game by selecting one of 4 different golfers, each with different capabilities. The golfers themselves run the gamut from Big Jumbo, a power hitter who very definitely is a reference to Japan's all-time golf champ Jumbo Ozaki, to Pretty Amy, who lacks power but makes up for it with precision. And then there's Lee Trevino, appearing here under his pro nickname, Supermex. He's the all-around Mario type. Although I suppose that paradigm wouldn't be established for a few more months in Super Mario Bros. 2, so I guess technically, Mario is the Lee Trevino type. Each golfer's unique attributes give players more variety as they take on the same 18-hole course over and over, lending the package a decent amount of replay value compared to single avatar golf sims. SNK also invested some effort into presentation. As with Bases Loaded, Fighting Golf somewhat mimics the aesthetics of the broadcast sport. The game lets you switch up the viewpoint of its various interface windows to provide you with different perspectives as you tee up and play. It's a sort of picture-in-picture effect, that helps you make tactical choices for each shot. Fighting golf even dresses up the passive process of watching the ball fly toward the green. The ball loves to hook rather than sail straight, so this expanded wealth of information becomes essential to learning the fussy physics involved in driving to the green. The game has something akin to a tutorial, a new innovation for the NES. In the introduction to each hole, you're given a visual overview of the green, along with a terse text description of the best strategy for approaching it. This isn't necessarily a game changer, but it is useful information for those just coming to terms with the genre. Fighting golf also contains a less admirable first for the NES too. Every time Pretty Amy whiffs a swing, she pitches forward in despair, causing her underwear to show. It's the system's first real flirtation with the medium's love for humiliating and objectifying women as a reward to players. Well done, SNK. Sarcasm aside, Fighting Golf gives players a polished up take on a game previously seen on NES, offering enough additional depth and refinement to merit attention. It does not, however, contain any fighting. Just as Bases Loaded's Japanese title attempted to pitch the game as inherently exciting by presenting it as burning, as in all fired up or fiery spirits, the fighting in Fighting Golf is clearly meant to evoke the idea of golf as a contest of strength and will. Lee Trevino does not throw hands with other golfers.
The price is wrong, bitch.
Even though this comes from the same company that would give us the King of Fighters a few years later. But really, that's the wrong SNK comparison to make. The correct comparison is to the company's future Nazca-developed Neo Geo sports masterpiece, Neo Turf Masters. Sorry, I mean Big Tournament Golf, because sporting events have become big weenies of other legacy trademarks. From the dynamic camera angles to the 4-character selection system, Fighting Golf definitely comes off as a dry run for one of the greatest video golf games of all time. Obviously, this cartridge plays like a round of miniature golf compared to Neo Turf Masters Pro Tournament, but you've got to start somewhere. Next time on NES Works, the deluge of shooters begins.